The topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart.
Hello, and welcome to It's Your Voice, the show that hosts enriching conversations in diversity and in climate solutions. My name is Bahia Yaksan. I'm a diversity educator and a core alignment coach. I support organizations and individuals in aligning their actions with their values. I also teach a communication method that I developed specifically to help people communicate across differences, including ideological differences, and to build relationships rather than alienate. And if you're interested in seeing sample programs and courses I have offered, you can check out my website, which is knowwhatyouvantcoaching.wordpress.com. That's just samples I tailor to every organization, to your specific needs and demographics, etc. So today we have a amazing guest, Zoe Weil, and I want to read her introduction, and believe me, it's worth every second. But Zoe, I'd like you to come out and join me so people can see you as I read just some of your many, many accomplishments.
Well, thank you, Bahia. It's wonderful to be here.
I'm so glad to see you. Zoe Weil is the co-founder and president of the Institute of Humane Education, which is called IHE, where she created the first graduate programs and comprehensive humane education linking human rights, environmental sustainability, and animal protection. These programs are offered online through an affiliation with Antioch University. Check it out. IHE also offers a solutionary micro-credential program and award-winning teacher resources to help educators and change makers bring solutionary practices to students and communities, which you will hear all about solutionaries and what that is and what that means. Zoe is a frequent keynote speaker at conferences and has given 6 TEDx talks, including her acclaimed TEDx, The World Becomes What You Teach. She's the author of 8 books, including her 2024 book, The Solutionary Way, Transform Your Life, Your Community, and the World for the Better. And she's a #1 Amazon bestseller in the philosophy and social aspects of education. And there are several titles I can share. The World Becomes What We Teach, Educating a Generation of Solutionaries. She has won the Nautilus Silver Medal for Most Good, Least Harm. Moonbeam Gold Medal winner, Claude and Medea, and above all, be kind, raising a humane child in challenging times. In 2023, Zoe was a recipient of the Spirit of America Award, which honors people who follow their conscience and act against current thinking to stand up for equity, freedom, and the American spirit of justice. She was also a subject of the Americans Who Tell the Truth portrait series by the artist Robert Shedderly, who has been a guest on my show before and will be again. And she holds a master's degree from Harvard Divinity School and the University of Pennsylvania, and awarded an honorary doctorate, that's a big deal, from, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correctly, is it Valparaiso University?
Valparaiso.
Valparaiso. Well, thank you again for being here.
You're most welcome. Thank you for having me. It's a little humbling and embarrassing to hear one's own bio read.
I'm sorry I put you through it. I know sometimes it's
No,
hard.
I'm honored, truly. Thank you.
And I've been an admirer of yours for years and years. I used to pass the IHE in my life in Maine. And I was thought, oh God, that's such a great place. Oh my gosh, I want to learn more about it. And here's one great opportunity. So let me ask you, there's so many questions I want to ask, but let's start with, if you don't mind telling us what you mean by solutionary, what a solutionary is, and why we need to educate people to become solutionaries.
Thank you. So a solutionary is a brand new word, but most people, when they hear it, they have a sense of what it might mean. But just to give you our definition of it, a solutionary is somebody who can identify unsustainable, unjust, and inhumane systems and transform them in ways that do the most good and the least harm for everyone. And when I say everyone, I mean people, animals, and the ecosystems that sustain life. So why do we need this new word? I mean, how is a solutionary different from a problem solver? Well, the difference is this ethical foundation that's embedded in the definition of doing the most good and the least harm. So an engineer can solve the problem of blowing up a mountaintop for coal removal, but they're not a solutionary. They could solve the problem of damming a river, but they're not a solutionary because the solutionary has that goal of doing good for everyone and avoiding harm to anyone. So the other thing that makes a solutionary different is that a solutionary is not the same as a humanitarian. So humanitarians are really important and really necessary. Humanitarians strive to alleviate suffering and diminish the impacts of harm, but humanitarians aren't focused on addressing the causes of suffering and harm and stopping them so that they don't persist. So solutionaries are looking for root and systemic causes of problems, and so we won't have those problems in the future. So I think it should be pretty obvious about why we need solutionaries. We need solutionaries because we face a lot of problems. And unless we are thinking in a systems thinking way, in other words, we're looking at how things connected and trying to address the causes of problems. And unless we're trying to do that with the fewest unintended negative consequences, there's the possibility that the efforts we're going to make may not be as strategic or effective as we would want them to be. And we also could cause unnecessary harm in the process. So that's the definition. And hopefully people are thinking, yeah, we need more of those. And they'll want to be a solutionary too.
It's kind of irresistible.
I love that.
Care about life on the planet. And I'm curious. I have so many questions, as I said, but it might be helpful for viewers and listeners to hear your preface of the book so they get a picture of like your overall philosophy and your approach and the tremendous amount of hope that you have. So would this be a good time for you to read the preface and then I can follow?
Yeah, absolutely. And I need to put on my glasses to do that. A better world is possible. We have the ability to develop sustainable and humane food, production, energy, and other systems. We can end poverty and treat all people equitably. We can learn to solve conflicts without violence and create enduring peace. We can usher in a culture of compassion toward animals, slow the rate of extinction, and restore ecosystems. How can we build this better world? By becoming solutionaries. This book makes a bold promise. If you become a solutionary, in addition to making important contributions in your community and world that lead to a healthier, happier future for others, your own life will be enriched. You will have tools for bridge building and meaning making. You will make new friends and build collaborative relationships. You will develop a greater sense of agency and efficacy. This is not a feel-good book, but you are likely to feel better if you read it, put it into practice, and share the solutionary process with others. I wrote this book for people who are already working to create change, as well as those who are frustrated, frightened, and furious, but haven't figured out how to channel these emotions into positive actions. I wrote it for those who are despondent and even despairing about the state of their communities, countries, and continents, with the pledge that meaningful accomplishments and evidence-based optimism are the likely outcomes as you develop solutions to problems. I wrote it for Gen Z, millennials, Gen X, and baby boomers, because we all have a role to play in building a better future.
That is so helpful and uplifting. And I want to note that I think it was Jane Goodall, right, who wrote the forward.
Yes, which was, you can only imagine what an honor that was to have Jane Goodall write the foreword to one's book.
Yes, that is huge. And can you like, I wrote down like the C, recognize, seek, and focus. I don't know if you refer to those as phases, but can you kind of briefly explain like the stages of becoming a solutionary? With
Sure. Yeah. So, the solutionary process, we call it a framework. We are using that in schools. And it's a four-phase process. And before I talk about those four phases, I want to say that the very first thing that I recommend people do who want to go on this solutionary journey is to ask themselves three questions. What problems do I want to solve in my life, my community, my state, my world? Second question is, what am I good at? And the third question is, what do I love to do? Because if we can direct what we're good at and what we love to do towards solving problems we care about, our life is really quite golden because we're going to have meaning and purpose and really shine. So those are the first three questions to ask. Now, the solutionary process itself has then these four phases. And the first phase is to identify a specific problem that we want to solve. And we might care about really big issues like war or climate change or animal cruelty, really big topics or problems. But when we go on the solutionary path, we want to make sure that we are identifying a problem that is feasible for us working collaboratively with others to solve. So it's within our sphere of influence. And I always recommend that people really try to hone in on a narrow problem within the bigger problem that they want to solve. Because as they get more practice and they succeed, they can take on more and more over time. So the next phase of the solutionary process is to investigate. So identify, investigate. What do I mean by investigate? Learn everything we can about that problem, about its causes. Learn from stakeholders. And when I say stakeholders, I mean not only those who are affected negatively by the problem and the systems that perpetuate it, but also those who want that system to continue because they're benefiting in some way. Because we're going to have a lot of resistance if people don't want to see changes to whatever systems are perpetuating these problems. So we need to talk to a lot of people, and we need to build bridges, and we need to really, really understand the issues. So that's a deep dive into research and
Yeah.
investigation. The third phase is innovate. You notice these all start with I, so that it's easy to remember them. So innovate a solution. And to go about innovating a solution, we want to find leverage points where we can make a change that's going to have a big impact. And we're going to want to come up with a variety of solutions and then really assess which ones are most solutionary, meaning they're going to do the most good and the least harm. They're really going to address the root or systemic causes of that problem. And then the fourth and final phase is to implement our solution. And the implementation process is iterative. We're going to implement and analyze and assess and evaluate and then make changes to improve upon our ideas. And so we can keep continuing to be a solutionary. So that's the process.
I really love the emphasis on all stakeholders, that includes the folks who might who are benefiting from the system.
Yeah.
Like presumably a company that's making a profit who's like, that's what we rely on, that's what we pay our people with. We don't want to change a system that you might be challenging. So I love that. I think that's such a key part of what must make a solutionary successful is you build relationships with everyone who's looking at this from all these different perspectives.
Right.
Because that, I mean, it's very difficult to make ground if you're trying to exclude your so-called opponent, which takes me to my next question. Another thing I love that you emphasize is like your discussion and early on about the debate framework that's kind of
Mhm.
ingrained in us in the mainstream educational systems that are still in operation. So
Yeah.
and the switch from either or to the solutionary way of looking at things. Can you say a little bit about that?
Sure. So I think it was 2009. I was in my car and I was listening to the radio and I heard this announcement about this debate that was going to be happening at New York University. And the debate was around whether or not the United States was responsible for Mexico's drug wars. And when I first heard it, I thought it was really odd. So here was NYU, and this is it was called Intelligence Squared. Now the series is called Open to Debate. But they were going to bring in these experts, these brilliant people who were going to argue this one question, this one very narrow question, whether or not the US was responsible for Mexico's drug wars. And I immediately thought, like, why are they doing that? Why not bring in these experts to talk about how could we end Mexico's drug wars? And what are the underlying issues that are even causing these drug wars, like poverty and inequity and lack of access to education? And what about the impacts of this, like drug addiction and overdose deaths? I mean, there's so many problems embedded in this strange question about blame that
Mm,
seemed to me a better use of our time. And it got me thinking about debates in general and our focus on debate. So in the United States, I mean, debate teams are really common. When my son went to high school, participating in a debate was a requirement for graduation. And these students were going to be assigned one side or other of a fabricated problem or a fabricated debate topic and research and then argue and strive to win. And then we have to ask ourselves toward what end, right? What, yes, the students are going to be developing critical thinking skills and research and investigation skills and persuasion skills. And those are all great to develop. But those same skills could be developed if the students were tackling a problem that they cared about. And, even if we wanted to turn it into some sort of competition, you, you could have teams that were competing to come up with the best solution. Now, it'd be great if they could just collaborate and come up with multiple solutions and implement different solutions and see what's working. And there are many ways we could go about that. But even if we wanted to use that competitive framework, we could still do it with the goal of solving problems. So that's why I think we need to rethink this either or framework that we're constantly encouraged to think in our society. And we're encouraged by the media, we're encouraged by politicians, we're encouraged in schools, as I just mentioned, to choose a side and to think in this binary way when there are always so many more ways to think about issues than the binary that is presented to us.
that as you describe it, it seems so obvious and so practical. Why would we not want to cultivate our children and our own brains to apply critical skills and knowledge and research time to finding solutions? And it's also a lot more fun collaboratively. It is so much more satisfying and validating to have to be working with other minds rather than against.
Yes. Yeah. And it's not to say that a solutionary cannot work on their own. It's not as if one can't come up with solutions independently, but that collaborative process increases the likelihood of solutions that take root and spread because we're working with other people.
Well, thank you for that. When I said the word fun, it reminded me of something fun in your first chapter of the Solutionary Way, when you talk about why you promote the principles of is it stand-up comedy?
Oh, improv comedy.
Improv comedy. Yes, please share.
So my husband and I started taking improv comedy classes quite a long time ago, and there's some fundamental rules in improv comedy. And over the years, I realized how profound these rules were for life in general and for being a solutionary in particular. So the four foundational rules of improv comedy are build relationships, embrace yes and I'll explain what that is, and bring the love and help others shine. So those are the rules. What do they have to do with being a solutionary? Well, sort of like what we've been talking about already in terms of reaching out to stakeholders, it's really important to build relationships. So in improv comedy, two people may start a scene and they immediately establish a relationship between them. And if they don't establish a relationship, the audience is sort of like, who are they? I don't care about them. They don't care about each other. But as soon as they care about each other because they have a relationship, then the audience cares. So that means that even if an improv actor gets up and creates some relationship and the other person doesn't like the relationship, doesn't want that relationship, doesn't matter. They have to go all in on that relationship. Well, that's true when you want to be a solutionary too. So, there are plenty of people that we shy away from in terms of having relationships because maybe they have different values than we do, different belief systems than we do. There can be a host of reasons why we want to stay with our in group and be surrounded by people who think like us. And to the degree that we can push ourselves to build relationships with those who are different in whatever ways from us is the degree that we may be able to understand issues in a more complex way because we hear from other people, that we may be able to build bridges, that we may be able to collaborate across divides, and that we may be able to just slowly but surely erode the polarization and the division in our society that is just, in my mind, really tearing us apart and preventing solutions. So that's the first rule. The second rule is to embrace yes and. So what does that mean? So in improv comedy, if an actor offers a suggestion for something, the other actor is going to say implicitly yes to it. They're going to accept whatever that is. They're not going to deny it. They're not going to say, what are you talking about? I'm not going, I don't even know what you mean when you just called me dad. I'm not your dad. Like that would be a denial of what they were given. So they're going to say yes to it. And they're like, yeah, son, or yeah, daughter. And they're going to accept it. And then they're going to add to it. So in terms of being a solutionary, yes and reflects our ability to listen to somebody with whom we may have very serious disagreements and find something to say yes to. And there's always something that we can say yes to. So, for example, I'm pro choice. I have friends who are pro life. I can absolutely say yes to wanting as few girls and women to face an unwanted pregnancy as possible. And I have never met a pro life person who can't say yes to that as well. That is something we can both say yes to. And then we add the and. So I'm going to listen to what they have to say. I'm going to share what I have to say. But by finding something we can say yes to, some place of agreement, then we've built a little bridge for the potential for some way of moving forward. Okay, the third rule is to bring the love. So in improv comedy, love always trumps hate. And that's because, when you're sitting in the audience, you don't want to watch an argument. I mean, the only person I know who can successfully pull that off in improv is Larry David. He's the master of it. But for most of us, it's just not that fun to watch disagreements and anger and hate unfolding on stage. We want to see the love. So bring the love. How can we bring the love? We are so programmed, I think, naturally, but also culturally, to be angry and
Mm.
so I use this example sometimes. When we're driving in traffic and everybody is driving next to us safely and responsibly, and there aren't accidents all around us, we are generally not thinking, oh, I love all these people driving next to me, yay, thank you, all of us driving so safely and well side by side. We don't think that. But if anybody cuts us off, we lay on that horn. We are like, sometimes we're just consumed with fury, even if they haven't, you know, done anything to endanger us. They've just like cut into our lane and we didn't like it. So that impulse to anger is so common. And the impulse for love, we often have to really cultivate it. So the actors do that in improv. And to the degree we can do it as solutionaries, is the degree that we also can build these bridges. And then finally, the last rule of improv comedy that I want to talk about is to help others shine. So
Mm.
when we can find people and projects that are doing good and we can shine the light on that instead of sort of persistently shining the light on the things that make us angry and mad. I mean, you just, you go on Twitter or X and you just see how much anger and vitriol is there. And if we can shine the light on what is good, then we can help that grow. And if we can shine the light on those who are flying under the radar and lift them up, all the better. So those are the rules of improv comedy that I like to apply to being a solutionary.
I love that. It's first of all, it's so interesting to find out what's behind improv comedy, and it's like, oh, how interesting that humans uh, want to see love being brought between two like spontaneous characters being made up,
Yes.
and being open. It's so much. It must be like you must have to have a really incredibly open, creative mind to go with the flow of improv comedy, which I can see would be very solutionary, very beneficial to being having a solutionary mind of being very open to possibilities and creative and seeing where you can find the yeses and then adding to it.
Yes. And if you're not always thinking about, you know, your agenda, and you're really yes-anding, it's not hard, right? So you get something,
Right.
you yes it, you don't know where it's going, they yes it, they don't know where it's going, but that back and forth, as opposed to if I walk in with my agenda and I'm gonna force that agenda down, I can't yes and people if I have that agenda to set. And so that's just a reminder that these relationships that we need to build, they really have to be authentic, that you really aren't going in with your agenda all the time. You're truly open to other human beings and their perspectives so that, and trusting that most people share core values of compassion, of I mean, if you ask people, what do you think are the best qualities of human beings? Nobody says greed. Nobody says hatred. Nobody says violence. I've asked thousands of people this question. Never have I heard that. What I've heard is compassion and integrity and honesty and courage and perseverance and generosity. So, those core values we share with people who have very different belief systems than we may have. And if we can find that place where we share values, there's a possibility of bridging the divides and creating positive change.
That is so encouraging. It's great that you have literally had thousands and thousands and thousands of opportunities to ask that question. And I believe that's true too. I kind of would like to add that I think that when we're born, that and people don't have to agree with me, of course. I think we're just naturally we're curious when you think about infants coming out. What are they doing? Wide-eyed, looking, curious. The next few months and years until we get some conditioning that says stop asking questions. Um, I think we're just really curious, and we love connecting. It's fascinating. People are interesting. We want to know,
Yeah.
and just returning to that. I'm just going to say human nature is, I think, really fulfilling and does really help people be authentic.
And it's also human nature that is leading us toward, greed and violence and hatred too. I mean, that's part of our nature as well. And so, how do we cultivate the best qualities, and how do we minimize the other qualities that lead us to create so many of the problems that we have?
Yeah, well put. Thank you. I actually, so I want to ask you about a specific issue
Sure.
uh, that I've thought about before, and then it's in, I think, your second chapter in the Solutionary Way of like the dairy industry and dairy products, and you ask questions like that I've wondered. I guess I've gotten glimmers before of information of like, and I've never researched it, but like, oh, wait a minute, we don't need milk, or I don't have to keep giving my kids cow milk after, like, what's the information? What's the truth? Was it just all great advertising campaign to support the dairy world? But anyway, I'm just trying to bring up the example of, I think some of the questions you asked in the book is, why do we consume milk from another animal? And why do we consume milk from an animal ongoingly, even beyond when we would be naturally nursing our babies or toddlers? And do our dairy products actually beneficial? So anyway, I just wanted to see what you additionally more about that. I'm sure some solutionaries have looked into that specifically, but anything else you would want to add, I would love to hear about the dairy industry specifically as an example.
Sure. So, yeah, I use that in an example in the chapter called Most Good, Least Harm. So, this principle, as I mentioned before, doing the most good and the least harm to people, animals, and the environment is the foundational ethical principle that underlies being a solutionary. And I have also asked thousands of people, do you think it's a good principle by which to personally live? And nobody's ever said no. So we tend to agree, yeah, let's do the most good and the least harm. That makes sense. So how do we go about doing that in this complex globalized world where the choices we make about what we eat and what we wear and the products we use and buy and the energy we use and the transportation come to us through this web of a global economy, and we don't know the impacts. And so I use the example of milk because, most people in the United States anyway consume dairy products and don't give it a second thought. And
Mhm.
so when we're trying to do the most good and least harm, there are three more I's. I know I mentioned the I's for the solutionary process. There are these other three I's for how do we go about even understanding the choices that we want to make. So the first is inquiry. So we inquire about whatever it is. So we might inquire about that cheese that we're eating. And the second is introspection. And then the third is integrity. So after we've inquired about whatever we want to learn about, then we have information and we have to introspect and ask ourselves, is what I learned actually aligned with my actions? And so we think about that. We self reflect on that. And then that allows us to make choices based on our integrity, based on our values. So I talked about dairy products just because it was an example of something everybody's aware of. And I became I became a vegetarian back in I don't know, the early 80s. And I was still consuming dairy products and I was still consuming eggs because I thought, oh, well, these animals are not killed for that. The reason I became a vegetarian is I didn't want to harm animals unnecessarily. And then I learned about the dairy industry in more depth, and it was so shocking. So, for example, I grew up thinking that cows just spontaneously produced milk. And I know that that sounds crazy, but I think most people, most children probably think cows just unless they grew up on a farm and know that a cow doesn't produce milk unless she has a baby, because that's who she's producing milk for. But I just had no idea. I thought we were just doing cows a favor by milking them and taking their milk because they needed to be milked. And that was what I was taught in storybooks. But the reality is that in order to get a cow to produce milk, we artificially inseminate her. This is in our modern agricultural system. So I'm not talking about somebody who personally has a cow on their own personal farm. I'm talking about when you go to the supermarket and you get some milk or you get some cheese, this is where it's coming from. So those cows, they produce a calf, and we take those calves away from their mother within a day. And cows have been known to bellow out for many days when their babies are essentially kidnapped from them. I mean, they are mammals just like we are. They love their offspring. They want to care for their offspring. And we take that calf away so that we can take the milk that's meant for that calf for ourselves. And we have forced cows to produce so much milk for us that about 30 to 50% of them wind up with mastitis, which is a painful udder infection, which requires that we give them antibiotics. And so sometimes antibiotics can then get into dairy products. So what happens to the calves? Well, if the calves are male, which is half of them, they're of no use to the dairy industry. So they're either going to be used for the beef industry or they're going to be used for veal. And a lot of people have heard about the veal industry and calves being chained at the neck in tiny stalls and so that they don't develop any muscle and it keeps their flesh tender. And they live for 4 months and then are forced by electric prod to get onto a slaughter truck after 4 months and are killed so that we can have this very fancy veal. And when I realized that veal was essentially the same thing as dairy products, and that these cows were forced to do this year after year until they were just so depleted and often lame that they were dragged to slaughter to become hamburger, I realized like, oh, there is no difference. And so I stopped consuming dairy products. Anyway, that is a long explanation, but I just use it as an example. And I also talk about eggs, and it's very similar. And in case anybody's thinking, I don't want to read this book, it's a very small section where I'm using this as an example of how to investigate and think so you can make the choices that you want. The book is really quite positive and hopeful. It's full of the last chapter is just devoted to solutions to the problems that we face in our economic system, our political system, our biomedical research system, our education system. So there's lots about the book that is really, really hopeful and based in evidence that a better world is possible.
Thank you. And thank you, Rebel. Rebel, can you put up again for the people who can see the quote from Jane Goodall? Can you read that, Zoe? So people can hear what one statement she made in your foreword of your book.
Sure. I am convinced that we must address the critical issues that this book highlights. A better world is possible if we become solutionaries. And that was Jane Goodall.
Yeah, U.S. Messenger of Peace. Thank you. And we still have a good 10 minutes, but I'm just thinking about for people who are listening on the radio or the podcast, can you say how they can order the book? Can
Oh,
you say
sure. So people can get the book anywhere they get books. So wherever you get your books, if you want to get it from an independent bookstore, you might have to ask them to order it. It would be fantastic if you would ask your library to order the book. But wherever you get your books, you can get this book. And if you like it, let me know, and feel free to give it a good review on Goodreads if you do like it, or on Amazon if you get it there. And yeah, I'm grateful for people spreading the word. My hope is that everybody not only gets a copy for themselves, but then that they get a copy for their senators and representative and their governor. And because we need our politicians to become solutionaries desperately.
that is a really good idea to send it to our elected officials who are meant to represent our views.
Yeah, and who are meant to solve problems, like, that's their job. So, let's
Yeah,
help them be solutionaries.
that's a really good idea. And again, before I forget, I noticed people can pre-order the book. Is that right?
Yes, so the book comes out on June 25th, so that's coming right up, less than 2 weeks away, but you can pre-order it now. So I hope people will.
At www.thesolutionaryway.com.
So, you can go to solution if you wanna read a little bit about the book, you can go to our website, thesolutionaryway.com, and you can find links there to order the book. So thesolutionaryway.com.
Thanks. I just want to make sure we got the message out very clear.
Thank you.
I also wanted to ask you if you can, it might, a rubric might sound kind of dry to people, but I think it's helps for people who like to picture frameworks.
Yep.
Can you describe the solutionary rubric? I notice it has like, emerging, developing, like
Yes.
those four
So
categories.
yeah. So, when we're coming up with solutions, there are going to be some that are more solutionary than others. So we have this rubric where emerging, it's not quite solutionary yet. It may be humanitarian, but it's not looking at the root or systemic causes of the problem. And it might be solving the problem, or attempting to solve the problem in a way that has a lot of unintended negative consequences. Now, the developing category is, well, we might be addressing root or systemic causes, but we're still causing unintended negative harm to one group. So, for example, if you wanted to create a solution to the problems of hunger, and that included causing more animals to suffer and die, or um, more habitat to be destroyed for grazing land, for example, that would not be a solutionary solution, because there are other groups that are being harmed in the process of trying to solve this original problem. So the solutionary category of the rubric is that the solution does address root and systemic causes, and it strives to have as few unintended negative consequences as possible. And then when we get to most solutionary, like that final section of the rubric, that's where we are really solving that problem in a way that does the most good and the least harm. So the whole idea of the rubric is just so that when we get to the point where we're trying to come up with solutions, we're really asking ourselves those questions. And the one thing I remind people about is, you don't have to reinvent the wheel as a solutionary. There could be really good solutions that just need to be spread, that somebody could have come up with a great solution, but they're not really good at scaling it or sharing it. But you could scale it or share it, or you could see a solution happening in another state and you bring it to your state. Maybe it's a legislative solution or a policy solution. So, if we keep our eye out and we are shining the light on other solutions, and then we can help them to grow and spread.
Thank you. That's very helpful to hear. I was thinking of one more example. I'm looking at my notes where to me, it was a reminder of the overlap of environmental destruction and racism. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I mean, that's part of like do the most good and the least harm. Like,
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
you
I
talk a
mean,
little bit about that intersection? Because I think that that concept, intersection of like environmental racism, is not grasped as easily as
yeah.
one might think.
Well, it's interesting. I'm going to give an example here in Maine. So Maine has very strict laws on open pit mining. And that is because of previous mining that has really affected poor communities because there's been so many toxic residues left. So there's this couple in Maine. They have a lot of acreage in very rural area. And this area has the largest lithium deposits, and they're not able to mine it, even though the impacts, they're environmentally conscious. They want as few impacts as possible. But this Maine law, with the best of intentions that was passed many years ago, prevents the mining of this lithium. Now, lithium is needed in the conversion to green energy and for our batteries. And so this is complicated, right? And one of the things that we forget is if we say, well, we're not going to do this in Maine because we are environmentalists and we don't allow this sort of thing, guess where we're getting that lithium from? You know, we're getting it from other countries where there are much poorer people who have absolutely no recourse because of the powers that are going to decide that this is their areas there where they live are going to be mined whether they like it or not. So, you know, out of sight, out of mind, right? We might want to have an electric car and charging that battery, and we need that lithium, and we don't want it to happen in our backyard. And so that's sort of an example of like, how can we think in a solutionary way about this? And I would love to sort of share like the way in which I'm trying to change a system as a solutionary. So I wrote this book, but this book is an example of the work that we do at the Institute for Humane Education, where we are trying to change the education system, because the education system is the root system underlying every other societal system. So our whole approach is to educate young people to be solutionaries, to have these skills. So we are working with schools across the globe. We're in 19 countries right now, across the globe, and schools are educating their students to be solutionaries. And we are educating the leaders of the solutionary focused humane education movement through our graduate programs with Antioch University that you mentioned in when you introduced me. So this is how I'm trying to be a solutionary myself, is by addressing this particular system. And what I hope is that listeners, watchers will be thinking, what system do I want to change? And again, what am I good at? What do I love to do? How can I put that all together? And for those who are actually interested in transforming the education system, I invite you to visit our website, humaneeducation.org, and get involved in the humane education movement.
Thank you. So what a lovely way to just sum up what's most important to you, and reminding people of this, of your website, and to choose, like, to focus on what matters to the most. And we just have a minute left, so I would want to just brag about you for a second, for people to know that you're in CrossFit training and super duper strong physically as well as mentally and intellectually and spiritually. So I enjoyed that, and I think that's so fun. And just here's my closing question for you to think about. Um, See if you and your husband would like to come on and do some improv comedy on my show sometime. Wouldn't that be fun?
That that would be fun and very stressful.
Okay, we'd have to take the stress out of it. But in the meantime, Zoe Wild, thank you so much for being our guest. People go look up her TED Talks, look up the Institute of Humane Education. She has 8 books. The Solutionary Way is coming out June 25th. So much, you bring so much good to the world. I so appreciate you.
Oh, thank you
I also,
so much. I really,
I,
really appreciate it.
I'm so glad. And I want to thank our listeners and our viewers, and Rebel, our engineer, and our producer, Dean Piper. And may we all have enriching conversations in diversity and in climate solutions this week. And we'll see you next Wednesday, 8 p.m. Eastern Time on W4CY or Talk4TV. Good night.
Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate